Hi, welcome to Jot Notes, a podcast where we dive into the world of books and the lives of authors. My name is Jenna Green. I'm a YA fantasy and children's author of the Reborn Mark series, the Imagine series, and the children's book, Winston the Well-Dressed Wombat. You'll notice Miranda O is not here today, but we wish her family, her growing family, well wishes and congratulations and all that jazz. But it's not really about myself or Miranda. It is about our wonderful guests that we have on the show each time we record. And today we are blessed, honored, and privileged to welcome Lorna Schultz. Lorna Schultz is has loved to read and write since she was a child. Her journey as an author has taken many dips, bends, twists, and turns over the year, but writing has always been part of her adventure. She's a former scriptwriter, lifestyle reporter, researcher, and producer, but she is now a full-time novelist and nonfiction author. So, Lorna, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Jenna. That was a great introduction. Thank you so much. I really appreciate that.
No worries. So I introduced you, and it's very formulaic. But if you were to describe yourself or introduce yourself, what would you say?
Well, that's always hard when you get put on the spot and you have to talk about yourself because you'd rather talk about your books. But okay, so I'm from Edmonton, Alberta, Canada. So yeah, and I've published 49 books now, which is really exciting. The 50th will be out in the spring. I love writing. I love reading. I also love sports. I know we're going to talk about that a little later. And when I was a kid, if you asked me what I wanted to do when I grew up, I didn't say I wanted to be a writer. I said I wanted to be an athlete. My parents said, there's no such thing. You can't make a living doing that. Pick something else, be a teacher. Anyway, so that's probably enough about me. And I've got lots of books and I love talking about them.
That's awesome. We're actually neighbors, not super close, but I'm from Lethbridge, so we're about 4 or 5 hours drive apart. Yeah, we're not
too far.
You guys get a little bit more snow.
Yeah, we do.
Yeah. 49 and then 50 books. Like I'm 40, so I'm thinking like what? That's like a book a year, but starting when you're like 1, 0. Like how does that work?
Oh, well, you know what? I got lucky there for a few years and I was writing more than one book a year because I had a series called the Puckster series and they're children's picture books. So I wrote 2 of those a year. And then I sometimes combined that year with a novel because I didn't actually get my first book published until I was until 2004. I didn't write. I wasn't an author in my 20s, and it was like in my 30s when I actually started to really write a lot because I was doing all kinds of other things and made that decision when I had my children to actually try to pursue it and make some money doing it and, possibly like sell some books, that kind of thing. So it was when my children were young. So I had some really good years where I was selling, quite a few books in one year. So that was really, really keen, really lovely.
Are you going to have a big old party or a big old celebration when you hit 50?
I don't know. I did for my 50th birthday, but I'm not sure I will for my 50th book, but maybe I will. I mean, why not? I guess I could do a launch and have a big party.
I definitely will. I mean, I'm at like 7, so 50 is far off, but my birthday's in December. My birthday's December 21st. My 40th, I got squat. I got no part. Like, it's like, you're lucky you get a cake. So maybe when I get to 10 books, I'm going to have a party and we'll call it a birthday because I'm a Christmas baby. We get nothing. So you mentioned you wanted to be an athlete. I wanted to be a fairy princess, so that didn't work out. Although maybe, as a writer, you could always make yourself that. But you mentioned before you wanted to be an athlete. So 2 things, like, there's many different kinds of athletes. You could be a marathon runner, or you could be a kayaker, or you could be a gymnast or whatever. So kind of what athletics you were interested in. And then how did those 2 paths combine? How did we get from athlete to like artist and athlete don't always go together?
I know. I was one of those kids who loved sports. I joined everything. My mother always called me a joiner. She's the joiner. And I was the kid who did everything, you know, and I wanted to play this sport and I wanted to play that sport. And if there was a new sport in my neighborhood, you know, there was a softball team, I joined it. So I was a little bit of a joiner. So I did do a lot of sports, but I was also a voracious reader. So, you know, I love the Trixie Belden books, and I really wanted to be Trixie Belden and be in the Bob Whites of the Glen. And, you know, all the other books, the Narnia books, I read all the Little House on the Prairie, I read all the Anne of Green Gables. So I was a kid who also liked to read. So I had that thing with books and with sports. So, of course, when I get into high school, I didn't read as much, although I was always still reading. And then when I got into university, you know, I got into Leon Uris and The Fountainhead, Ayn Rand. And so I was still always reading as I was doing my sports. And, you know, I can't pinpoint a sport that I wanted to be an athlete in, except for I was a rower, and that's where I went the furthest. I played hockey, I played soccer, I played basketball, volleyball. Rowing was the one where I actually made the national team, and you know, was on the national team and won some Canadian championships and that kind of thing. I loved playing hockey. I played hockey all through my teens. And anyway, I mean, that's just who I was. It was something that was inside of me, and I was passionate about it. But I was also passionate about books. So I think that's where the combination comes in, and how then I feel really, really fortunate that I found writing, and that I can write about sports, and I can do that. I mean, I write books that aren't for sports. I get asked that all the time by kids. Do you write books? Do you have any books that are for sports? I said, yes, I do. I have lots of books that don't have a sport theme to them. But I mean, if you looked at my website, the majority of books do, but there are books that don't.
Well, they say write what you know, and it doesn't always have to be like literal. Like I write fantasy and I've never fought a dragon, but I've been scared, right?
Right.
And you can. I mean, I'm sure you have an in-depth knowledge of certain sports, but you can probably also write about sports you've never played because you understand athletics, competition. You know what the words might mean, right? I don't know the difference between an ump and a ref and I can't even think of a third, but you might, right? So you can have a perspective or a method of writing about all sorts of different sports and athletics that maybe someone else couldn't.
Yeah, I think that that's a really, really solid point. And I think when I come to write sports books, I do have the emotion that I can put into the books, because I've experienced the win, I've experienced the loss, I've experienced being cut, I've experienced making a team, I've experienced teammates also being a solo athlete in different things, you know, running your own race, or being in like a half marathon where you're just by yourself. So I have all of that experience that you can take to the table when you're writing. And when you say, I'm laughing at you because you said that you didn't, you didn't grow up with owning a dragon, but you grew up wanting to be a fairy princess.
I
So
did.
you had that in you.
I still kind of do.
Surprised me that you turned to science fiction, right? Or to fantasy, or to that element of your writing, right? So you had that in you. I had this in me. I do a lot of contemporary writing. Like I'm not a huge historical. I'm not a science fiction or fantasy. I do a lot of contemporary, but that's probably just who I am and how I grew up and what I grew up enjoying reading as well. Although I did love that Narnia series.
People always say, like, how do you pick what books to write? And I always say, well, I find that a lot of the times the story chooses the author. Like fantasy or not, I mean, I started writing when I was 17, so I was a teen. And then I worked with middle school for so many years that writing YA was just natural. And I still like reading YA. And so, I mean, and sometimes I've written a children's book and, you know, I've tried to write more adult content, not in the creepy way, but more like, you know, for that audience. But it's not because I made that choice so much as like you just wake up and you have an idea sometimes. And so, I mean, I stay away from Westerns because I don't have a clue, and historical seems like a lot of work. But do you find that the story kind of picks the author more than the author picks the story?
I think so. I think that the story comes to you, and sometimes it takes a long, long time to, you get that story, and then stays in your brain, and then you think about it, and then a couple of years later, all of a sudden you come up with this story again, and you think, oh, I had that a long time ago. Maybe I should write this story. Maybe I should, or something just twigs, right? You read something in the newspaper, and then you think, oh, well, that would be really interesting to write about, or how can I manipulate that, and how can I make that into a book? So I think things that in our lives, like I wrote a book called Taking the Ice. It's a hockey novel. It's for middle grade. And, when I do a school visit, I say to the kids, there's three things that made me write this book. One was traveling our Alberta roads, doing author visits, going around. I've been to High Level. I've been to Rainbow Lake. I've been down to Tabor. I've been to Lethbridge. I've been all over our province going to schools. And some of those roads are pretty long, right? And so, the boy moves from Florida to small town Alberta. So there's one thing. My son played a lot of hockey. I went to a lot of his games. There was always assistant trainers who filled the water bottles, who lined up the sticks, who helped out the teams. They often were autistic, or maybe had a brain injury, or were Down syndrome, something. So there's a character like that in the book. So there's different things that happen in our lives that we pick, and then we just kind of put them all together, and somehow, I don't know, we create a story. And it just I don't know how we do it sometimes.
Something happens.
Well, do you not wonder sometimes when you actually get your book and you start? I never read my book once it's published, though. I never read it from start to finish. The only thing I read is when I'm doing a reading, because I'm too afraid to find mistakes.
I'll scan it, and then I'll be like, did I write that?
Exactly. You think, did I write this? Like, when did I actually do that? When did I sit down at my desk and actually do that? But you get in the zone, right? Then you just get into that zone once that idea gets fleshed out, and you think, oh gosh, I can see the end of this, and I'm going to go hard at this. So I think that the story does come to us. I think that it just is there. And every once in a while, I mean, I don't know about you, but when somebody says to me, oh, I have a story that I think you should write, I always say, well, you
can write it.
You can write it. When kids say that to me, because kids will say that to me, I always say, you know what? I think that's a story that you can write. And then they go, oh, could I? And I think, yeah, that's your story. That's not my story. That's your story. But we all have stories to tell. And there's always something that we can tell, right?
It's that, it's that going back to what you're saying, when you open up, you're like, oh, look at this, look what I wrote. And there is that moment of disbelief, because you remember the first draft, and the first draft was not good. And maybe the second draft was also maybe not good. And it goes through this whole process. So kids, and I'm a teacher, so I know, they're like, I can't do that. They can't look at a book and say, I can't do that. Well, no one can do that on the first try. It took like 3 years or 3 months and 90 edits, and that idea, all those steps in between. And that's what gets a little tricky, right? Because it's not like, okay, I want to be a lawyer. I'm going to do this, then I'm going to do this, then I'm going to take this exam, and then I'm a lawyer. Writing's not like that. It's really more about connecting with people, and your path is going to be totally different than my path. I mean, you said you started writing a little bit later, and some people earlier. People get lucky and they get a literary agent, or they overnight successes that take 20 years in the making. And it's not a steadfast standard path that everyone can take. And it gets it's a little tricky on trying to maneuver your way into a story and wait for the muse to take over and hope someone likes it. It's a winding path.
It is a windy path. And I think it's really hard sometimes not to compare yourself to other writers. And you can't do that. I mean, you always have to tell yourself, okay, so this is my journey. Like, there are people that get that agent with their first novel, their debut, and then they get a big, huge deal, and they get a New York Times bestseller, and it's like their first novel. And you think, well, that didn't happen to me. You
It's
know,
not
I
going to
mean,
happen to most people.
it's not going to happen to most. So you have to, but that's what the public sees. It's not what we, you know, there's a lot of us who are just working authors, and I mean, I just keep coming up with ideas. I just keep trying to publish, and you know, I have an agent, but I've had about 4 agents in my time, and I've had moments where I haven't had an agent. I've had spells where I didn't, right? Like, so everybody has to have their own journey, and I think that that's really important. But it's hard not to compare yourself with everybody else and say, oh my gosh, they just got this huge deal, you know, they're selling and all that kind of stuff. So I mean, it always looks different on the other side.
Oh yeah, it's so tricky. I mean, sometimes your story isn't ready, and you might have a brilliant story, but the agents are like, "Well, I'm looking for this, or it's not the right time,
Well,
or
you just sold something that was very similar to that. Like maybe you wrote a vampire story, or and then they just sold. I'm just using vampires because they're, you know, maybe they just sold a book like that. Or I remember going to a conference once in my early days, and an editor stood up at the front. It was a big American conference, and she stood up at the front and said, "We don't want any more Vietnam books." And I thought, I didn't have a Vietnam book, but I thought, I looked around and I thought, if somebody had one that they just written, that would have been devastating, right? That would have been absolutely devastating. That it was just like a hard no. They had enough of them, and so you know, I think that happens with all kinds of things that you can just, and somebody might just hit the mark where it comes out at the right time. And is that luck? Probably. There's somebody else who had a story who was just as good. So I think that we have to just sit back and write our own story and write what moves us. Because if we write what moves us, it's going to move the reader. And that's the most important thing. I mean, I started with children's, I didn't start with children's, I started with adult mystery novels. And because I'm a mystery buff, I love thrillers, I love mysteries, I love suspense. But then this friend of mine was writing a hockey novel, and she knew nothing about sports. She was writing sports novels, nothing. So she would phone me all the time and say, you know, what's an offside in soccer, and what's this and what's that, and I would answer her questions. And then finally I said, you know what, I should write one of those. And she said, oh, you should, because you know, I want to go on and write motorcycle books for the young adult audience, and these were middle grade. And she you know, helped me out and talked to her editor, and then I sent in a proposal because I thought of an idea from when I was in high school, and my friend had diabetes and we didn't know it. And so I took that story and I made it a boy who was like a hockey player, and he was like 12, and my son was, you know, about 10 at the time. So I was, as you say, I was listening to the language of the kids talk all the time. And because my kids were that age, I could write that age. And it sold. It's not what I started out to do. I did not start out to write children's. I started out to write adult mystery novels. But I got that little bit of luck, and it totally changed my path. It totally changed me, and I went into children's literature. And here I am, like 49 books later in the children's literature. I mean, some of those 49 books, probably about 3 or 4 of them are adult nonfiction. But for the most part, it's children's, right? I mean, but that's what I went into. And it was just not something I started out to do. But the story was there. Once I said, I should write one of those. And she said, yeah, you should. I thought, there's a story there. And I played hockey, so I can write this book. And it was pretty, like, it flowed pretty quickly. Like, I wrote it pretty quick. So, I mean, things happen, right? And we change paths and we move on, and everybody has a different journey. Is just what that roundabout was about.
and every story has a different journey. There's a few stories I've tried to write, and they just weren't ready yet. So you had to put them aside, and you know, and I've always been a YA author, and I thought maybe I would eventually level up, but I mean, I have a young one, so she's in grade 1. So now I've become more interested in, you know, those picture books and early reader books. And so you never know what you never know. That's just there's a life
Just
motto.
leave it at that. You never know what's going to come around the corner, right? In this business.
I think we have some feedback with your mic. I'm not 100% sure
Yeah,
what's
no,
happening.
you know what it is? It's feedback with my computer, and I can't do anything
Oh,
about it. It's my
okay.
computer.
No worries.
I think I have a fan that's going on my computer, and I'm so sorry about that. It started, I thought, oh gosh, there goes my computer again.
Don't worry. I think I flickered off for a second. I was like, "Oh, look, I was gone and I'm back."
Yeah, I'm
Well,
sorry
we'll
about that.
no
No,
worries. We'll just keep talking because you
it
mentioned
might stop. It
you
might
write
stop.
it might. You mentioned that you wrote some nonfiction, not a lot.
Mhm.
And I is it tricky to switch between adult books, children's book, or even like, like there's a children's books are like there's so many subcategories, right? There's
Yeah, and I write them
teenager.
all.
I know. So how is that challenging or is that
Uh,
just easy?
no, you know what? Again, Jenna, I think it goes back to the story. There's a story there, and that story is what it's all about. And so once I get started, it definitely, even nonfiction is about the story, right? So whatever you choose to do, that's what you need. That's what you do, right? You go with the story about what it's about. So I think sometimes the only thing with nonfiction is it's a little more tedious sometimes. Like fiction, you can sit down and you make that word count and you write all those words, and you have, like, you can say to yourself, I'm going to write like 5 pages or 1,000 words or whatever. Nonfiction, you can't necessarily do that. It takes you longer to write words because you're doing so much research and you're doing so much looking up of things. Like, I'm writing another amazing hockey story series book, and I was working on it today. So it just takes a while to find the games that the player played and where he scored a goal and where he didn't score a goal and where his team won, and you're looking up stats and things like that. So that's the difference, is that there's a little bit more of that with nonfiction. So and I love nonfiction. I do love it, but I'm always really grateful when I'm finished, because then I can go back to my fiction. And then
That
I can
sounds
go back to
very
the
true.
characters talking and setting up the plot and setting up the pacing and doing all that sort of stuff. Gosh, I'm really sorry about my computer. It's
Oh,
just
no
like,
worries. That makes total sense. I mean, I have to do a lot of world building. So I have to know a lot about what this world is like.
yes,
But I don't have to share it all. If the type of tea that they drink is not relevant, if the structure of their house is not relevant, I can just cut it out. But you have to put all those details in because I'm telling a story, and not that you're not telling a story, but it's more informational. So there are elements I can just bloop, bloop, bloop and get rid of. And you are making sure that those elements are correct, they're
yes,
in the right order, uh,
yes.
and that you have them. So that actually makes complete sense to me. I didn't know what you were going to say on that question, and now that you've answered it, I'm like, that makes total sense.
It
Yep.
makes, but there's also that element where you gather too much information, and then you have to weed through it, because you can't put everything in. You have to pick and choose what you're going to put into the book. And even though it's nonfiction, there's still going to be stories that aren't going to be relevant. Maybe they're not going to work, or it's going to be too much, or you know, it doesn't. Anyway, so you do have to still pick and choose as to what stories you're going to put in, especially from your interviews, because you're going to get way too much information, and you have to weed through it. And that's an important part of nonfiction too, is finding out all of that.
See, I admire you. I applaud you. I will read them, but it sounds like too much work. Uh,
Yeah,
I don't know if I could do it.
I like it. I do like it, but I do, as I said, once I'm finished with the project, then I just can't wait to get back into my novels. I'm so like, wow, I can't wait to start, like, just hearing characters talking and dialogue and all of that. Like I look forward to that. So
Oh, that makes total sense. So, what your most recent release? Is it nonfiction? Is it fiction? Is it what is your most
now,
recent book?
you asked how I got 49 books out. I had 3 out this year, so I have a little bit for everybody. So I have this one, which is a nonfiction, believe it or not. biography, picture book biography, which is on Joey Moss. I don't know if you've heard of Joey Moss. He was born with Down syndrome. He worked with the Edmonton Oilers as their equipment manager and the Edmonton Football Club as well. He became really popular, and everybody loved him. And he always tried to make people smile. So this is a book on Joey Moss. It's a picture book biography. So that's for the younger crowd, although there's a lot of older people that are reading it and loving it. And I think it could sit in every classroom. I really do. I think that it's a book because it is about Down syndrome and how though people that are born with Down syndrome, how they can be active in their communities. And he showed that. He's very motivational and inspiring. And then I have a picture book biography on Carrie Price. And this is a series that I've done, and this is about the 6th book. Now, this series is really interesting because it has photos, text, but it also has graphics.
Oh, nice. That's an interesting combination.
I don't do the drawings. By the way, Alice Carter did the illustrations for this. She did an absolutely amazing job. And D.A. Bishop does the illustrations for this. Now, it is my job, though, as a writer, I do write out the graphic sections. So I write out page 1, panel 1, panel 2, panel 3, panel 4, and I give him very explicit instructions because it is nonfiction. If they're wearing black jerseys on the day of that game, they got to wear black jerseys. If they're in their whatever color, their red color, you have to put that down, right? So I have to be very explicit, and it also had this photo. So these are, although they're not that big, they do take quite a bit of time to do because I do
absolutely.
There's 4 graphic sections, and I'll tell you something. Talking about editing, a couple of books back, I did all the graphic sections, sent it in. The editor said, "Yeah, well, I only read like 2 of them."
Oh,
so I had to go through it, and I had to do 2 more and skip those 2, and then whatever I put in those graphics, I had to put into the text. And anyway, it just was like, but that happens, right? So I've got that one. And I also have a novel, which is it's a young adult. So I think I have something for the little guys, the middle grade, and the young adult. And this is for probably like 12, 13 and up, 12 up maybe. It's the 5th book in a series. And it is about the Best Buddies Club. And it features 2 voices. One is a girl who has, Best Buddies Club is where they pair kids together, somebody with an intellectual disability and somebody without. And Gloria has fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, and Willa is her partner, but Willa also has dyslexia. So I put these 2 characters together, and it's an unusual friendship, but it turns into a very beautiful friendship. Aww. So it's all about friends, and there's lots of drama in it and lots of things going on, but it is the 5th in a series. And talk about the business. This series, there's 4 books previous, and they went, the publisher didn't survive through COVID. So the last book came out in 15, 16, 17, 18, 2018. And I didn't think that this 5th book was going to see the light of day, but I managed to find a publisher for it. So Red Deer Press actually published it. So I'm really grateful that I was able to get this 5th book published.
Oh, that's a good story. Yeah. That's a nice note to end on. I mean, this happens every time we film an episode, is that we run out of time because all I want to do is talk books and talk writing and and there's just never enough time. But let's say that every single person, and this is probably true, every single person that's watching and listening right now, they want all those books. Where can they go to find those books or to follow you so that when you get book number 50, they can help track it down right away?
Well, they could probably find most of them in chapters. And if they don't have them in chapters, you go right up to the desk and you say, "I really want this book. Could you bring it in?" I mean,
that's
we
right.
have to do that, right? We have to do that. So hopefully they're in the chapter stores in Alberta. I mean, or all over. I mean, this podcast is probably everywhere. And if not, always Amazon. I mean, I hate doing that. Local bookstores. I'm a very big independent bookstore person. So lots of independent bookstores will have them. And again, independents will pull them in because they're all there's all distributors, so they can do that. And my website, if you want to learn more about me, my website is lornaschultznicholson.com. And it's right there, like my name is there. So that's how you spell it. And it is SCHULTZ. that name gets spelt wrong a lot.
Like Charles Schultz. I got it.
But it's not, because Charles
Oh.
Schultz doesn't have a. He's got one letter. I don't think he has a C. He's
Now I
got
have to
one
go
letter
check.
missing of my name. It's different.
Well, we'll make sure that all those links are in the podcast description.
Thank
So we'll
you.
make sure that's
Thank you.
all in there. Well, thank you so much for. I didn't get through. I made it through some of my questions, but not through all of them. But I never do. But thank you so much for joining me today. I learned so much. And what I didn't learn, I was sitting there going, I agree. Yes.
I could have talked to you for like 2 hours.
I know. Unfortunately, I just don't have that many
know.
hours in a day.
Yep.
So thank you so much for
Thank
being
you
with
so
us.
much.
Just before we sign off, a big thank you to our show sponsors. So thank you to Creative Edge Publicity and the Writers Corner Network. And of course, to all our viewers and all our listeners, thank you so much. Bye.
Bye.